Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to tackle not only the last topic of this unit, but the last topic of IB biology. So you have made it. You have survived. Even though you may have been questioning how you were going to, you've done it. We're at the end. So our very last topic is called ethology. And this is basically just animal behavior, specifically looking at particular patterns that we can see in animal behavior. So these studies that we're going to be looking at, these behavioral actions that we're going to be looking at, are innate and automatic responses to stimuli, right? It's because of their genes, it's subject to natural selection. These variations that we're going to be looking at can either be selected for or against, depending on if they are improving or hindering the reproductive fitness of the population that we look at. And these innate behaviors become optimized over time through evolution, so they get better and better as they continue to evolve. So this is just a hypothetical example, but it does sort of show like a general overview of natural selection, right? The selection pressure here is food availability, and the innate response that we would be looking at is when these species are breeding. So if the food availability looks like this diamond, where there's a high amount of food in like the mid breeding season, you don't see a lot of like offspring being born in the early season because there's just not enough food to survive. You see a high amount right around the mid-season, and you don't see much in the late because it's all eaten, right? So individuals that breed just before or at maximum food availability promote their reproductive fitness, right? They are doing all that they can to successfully pass on their gene, because this innate response is genetic. That means that their children will also know to breed during this sort of like mid-season when the food is the most available. Now, this has sort of, that was like the hypothetical example. Now, okay, if we're selecting for and the food availability changes a little bit, so now it's coming a little bit earlier. So now the organisms that were breeding like when the peak, when the optimum amount of food was like a little bit later than what it is now, they might not be as successful as they were. So in this case, now we're looking at the individuals that breed just before like the maximum the maximum amount of food was available, because now we are seeing that that's where the biggest chunk of food availability is. So the optimal behavior has evolved to change. So now organisms that were breeding like maybe in this area, like a little bit after mid, but like still had a lot of food, not really anymore. So they are losing their like optimal amount of food, and so they might not survive, which means that their genes are not going to be passed on. Okay, so now we're going to look at some specific examples. We'll go back and forth between like types of behaviors and then specific examples. So the type of behavior that we're looking at right now is called colony living, and the example that I'm giving to you is a naked mole rat. I don't know, I just chose naked mole rats. They are blind, which is, I don't know, somehow makes them cuter. And eusocial. Eusocial means that there's like one queen, and then the rest of the females are, they don't reproduce, and so everybody works towards the queen. Kind of like how, like honeybees, right? They also are eusocial. So anyway, so like I said, it consists of one queen and a small number of reproductive males. Every other individual naked mole rat within that colony does not mate. So it's just the queen and a few males. So when that queen dies, the competition of who's going to be the next queen is extremely fierce and bloody. The social status of the naked mole rats depends on reproductive ability. So like you're cooler if you can reproduce, and you're like shunned if you can't. So that's interesting to see in like a different species. Non-reproductive individuals act altruistically. That is a term that we are going to dive much further into, but altruistically is basically promoting the good of other people over themselves. So these non-reproductive individuals promote the survival and reproductive fitness of the queen and her offspring. Like they would die to protect their queen. And they are all very closely genetically related because they all come from the queen. So natural selection can act at the colony level because they display what's called emergent properties. You did learn this in year 1, but we'll talk about it again. Emergent properties are it is sort of the idea that things are stronger as a whole than as its individual parts. So the colony as a whole is stronger, is more helpful than just an individual naked mole rat. In this example, the individuals are closely related, and whatever traits are advantageous, they will promote the reproductive fitness of the queen and ensure propagation of the genes. So she, the queen, is choosing individuals that have traits that will be advantageous to her. She wants to be protected, so she's going to choose men to reproduce with that are strong, they're good fighters, that can provide for her. Bad traits will be selected against, as always. That's just natural selection in a nutshell. And natural selection can still occur, of course, right? We know that female competition happens when the queen dies, and so the stronger those females are, the more likely they are to become the next queen. Additional examples of this can be found in honeybees and ants. So honeybees that are better at finding food will promote reproduction of the queen, right, because they're feeding the queen, which also helps the survival of the young bees. So those that are good at finding food, they will be able to pass on that gene. And ants that are better at defending the colony will ensure survival of the colony, so those traits will also be passed on. Now, we briefly mentioned altruistic behavior, but this is probably my favorite thing to talk about in this entire unit. I think that this is such an interesting idea, and it really made me, when I first started looking into it a little bit more, it really made me stop and think about myself, but also the world around me and what it actually means to be selfless. So an alternative word for altruistic would be selfless. This is where the individual's actions serve to promote the welfare or reproductive fitness of another individual at the cost to that individual. So you are helping someone at the expense of yourself. This behavior does promote reproductive success either through kin selection, reciprocal altruism, or a combination of the two. So kin selection is what we were just talking about, where you're helping the offspring. Reciprocal altruism we'll talk about on the next slide. But you have seen this in action. Honeybees do display altruistic behavior. They will sacrifice their own life for the colony's survival. Like if you get too close to honeybees, they will sting you. Well, when they sting you and the stinger comes off, they die, but they died protecting their queen. Okay, so they did it for someone else at the cost of their life. So altruistic behaviors are innate. They could be advantageous or deleterious, which is just they're either selected for or against. And altruistic behavior can benefit the gene. You will notice that I keep referring to the success of the genes that can be passed on. And that is something that is weird to think about, but all of these behaviors, all of these items that we're looking at, it all comes back to how well you can pass on genes that will be successful in the environment that they are in. So altruistic behavior when talking about kin selection is really just like ensuring the survival of shared genes. So you want to have genes that are already kind of like in the mix. You want to make sure that those genes get passed on and passed on and passed on. So you will do some sort of altruistic behavior to ensure that that happens. Reciprocal altruism is helping another person where you might not have like a immediate response, but you know that in the future that kindness will be returned. So that's ensuring the survival of oneself and also aiding in reproductive success, because you know down the line this person's going to owe you one, and so they will help you reciprocally, I don't actually know how to say that word, I guess, in the future. So shared genetic information, again, all of this is about the gene. Yes, we care about the behavior, but we care more about the success of the genes. So in related individuals, like when we're talking about honeybees or naked mole rats or anything like that, a lot of the genetic information is shared. And you can see that here, right? These red bits, they're shared genes, whereas the different colors are the individual genes that make up whatever the species is that we're looking at. So most of the genes are shared. Positive traits in the shared genes are selected for, as always, if an individual sacrifices its own reproductive fitness for the benefit of others, it promotes the success of the shared gene, because it will sacrifice itself so that the rest of the colony can continue to reproduce and pass on these shared genes. If these shared genes include those which have programmed the altruistic acts, they too will be passed on, and so will the behavior. So if, like a honeybee sacrifices itself for the queen, it has those shared genes, the queen can continue to reproduce, those genes will be passed on, as will that altruistic behavior that was coded into the gene, right, that made the original honeybee sacrifice itself. And so it will continue on, and the new bees that are the new offspring of bees will have that altruistic behavior, and so they will also be programmed to sacrifice themselves for the queen. So it's just like a continuation of like selfless acts, I guess. Okay, now our example of reciprocal altruism, my example species is going to be with vampire bats. That's what they look like in the top. They're like kind of ugly cute, but I think they're cute. So vampire bats get their name because they feed on blood, and also they kind of look like vampires from what we have depicted vampires to look like in film and art. So anyways, they need to feed on 50% of their body weight every day, pretty much, to survive. If they go 40 hours without feeding, they start to lose weight so quickly they basically just die if they don't get food. So they really do need to have a lot of blood around them, in them, like feed on blood, a lot of it, and very frequently. So they have developed what's called blood sharing, and they do this as an altruistic act. So this will typically happen between the females or with offspring of another female to ensure survival of one's own offspring if needed. So this is both altruistic and a little selfish, right? Because the idea of this is if you have extra blood, or you maybe had you ate enough to survive for like another 12 hours, you can give some excess blood that you have to either another female, or you can give it to another offspring. Okay, that's altruistic, because you are doing this to ensure survival of another organism at the detriment to yourself, right? They're not getting enough food. However, they're only doing this with the idea that if they needed blood later on, that person would owe them, right? That bat would owe them blood, and so they would know that somebody will help me when I need blood, like I helped that person when they needed blood. So this is where altruism gets a little tricky. Like, is it actually selfless or is it selfish? We'll talk about it. So individuals who do not reciprocate are actually kicked out of the group. They're shunned immediately. Like, I'm just picturing bats being like, you can't sit with us. Like, but honestly, they are kicked out, and will probably not survive because it's hard to get that much blood every day. And so this non-sharing behavior is actually selected against because the bats that don't share rarely survive to reproductive age. So reciprocation may be stronger between related bats, like if they're actually sisters, versus just bats within kind of the same group. All right, so foraging, we're going to define it and then we're going to talk about it. So foraging is the act of searching for, chasing, capturing, killing, and consuming food. All of an organism's idea of foraging is making sure the benefit outweighs the cost. So the benefit would be getting food, right? Getting energy. The cost would be how much energy it takes to actually take down whatever it is that they need to eat, right? So a lion will constantly be calculating the benefit over the cost on, is it worth my energy to chase this gazelle and, kill it, or am I going to waste too much energy chasing after it for the amount of food that I would get for it? So as long as the benefit of energy outweighs the cost, it will have a positive impact on the individual's reproductive fitness. However, if it has an overall cost, it's going to harm the reproductive fitness, and likely whatever that strategy is that they were using will be lost through natural selection. There is such a thing as optimal foraging, and optimal foraging is just making sure that the benefit to cost ratio is in the favor of the benefit, right? You don't want to spend more energy than you're going to get because that's a net loss, right? These animals have lived for so long that they have already evolved into their optimal foraging strategies. If you've ever seen a nature show, you have seen pack hunting, you have seen like camouflaging themselves until like the perfect opportunity presents itself. They have done this for generations and generations. So the optimal foraging strategy for most organisms has already been figured out. But as like nature changes around us and like global warming changes the pattern of food or the pattern of fish swimming in different areas, you will see that the optimal foraging strategies have been slowly altering to fit whatever the new like time frame may be. So that's been kind of interesting to see. Okay, again, continuing on with optimal foraging. Daphnia, which are these like tiny little animals that live in water, they represent a better benefit to cost ratio with foraging for these bluegill sunfish. So in times of abundance, bluegills will be selective of their prey, right? They will choose large Daphnia. They'll be like picky, right? They're like, oh, I only want the like 10-ounce Daphnia. They're very tiny, Daphnia are. Because they don't want to spend as much energy foraging. So they're like, okay, I can spend some energy picking for like the best looking ones, because there's so many. So like even if I don't find like the most delicious one, like I can still eat other ones. But in times of food scarcity, they're less selective because they don't care about how big it is. They just want to make sure that they have enough energy to survive. So that should make sense. Right? Like if you walked into a room and there was like 25 different desserts, you could be selective. You could say, okay, well, like that cake looks delicious, but I'm really in the mood for a cookie, so I'm only going to eat a cookie today. But if you walked in the room and there was only a brownie and you really wanted something sweet, you'd be like, okay, I guess today's a brownie. Like, I'm not going to be selective because I don't have much to select. Right? So although not identical, because you will survive without a brownie or a cookie, the idea is the same across the board. Okay, additional behaviors that we're going to look at, sexual selection. So some females will select their mates based on exaggerated traits. I'm sure you can figure out what my example is about to be, and that would be a peacock. The male peacocks are the ones with the tails. So they are the ones that have very exaggerated traits, and make sure that you are very aware of who they are and what they can bring to the table. They are advertisements of themselves. So they are advertising their own reproductive fitness and their own adaptations for survival. So they are showing off for the female. Competitions between males can be fierce, and the development of these traits is really just to be desirable to females, as like, hey, look at how beautiful my tail is. If we have a son, he will also have a beautiful tail like me, right? So females are looking at that with the lens of reproductive success of their offspring. So they might be like, ooh, that is a pretty tail, but they're more thinking, yes, you're right, my genes will survive if I mate with you, because my son will also be able to find a mate because the tail is so beautiful. So through descent with modification, that's just like a specific term, like descent with modification. As the genes get passed on, they get modified slightly. The traits become even more elaborate, so the tails get bigger, they get more colorful, they get brighter. And this mate selection can actually drive speciation between separated populations. So this can cause new species to develop. And the last thing we're going to talk about, second to last thing we're going to talk about, is rhythmical behaviors. So behaviors that are actually regulated over periods of time. So seasonal changes, circadian changes or daily changes, and lunar changes or monthly changes. These are also subject to natural selection and have been optimized over time. So like migration patterns, they take advantage of seasonal changes, right? So sharks and whales will take advantage of phytoplankton blooms, which happen seasonally. Turtle nesting will depend on the moon, because the moon illuminates beaches, so they have to be able to see the beach to be able to nest. And bee population booms during spring and summer, right, when flowers are available. So they have to be like thoughtful of like when food availability will be. So some additional examples of this, seasonal would be like waking from hibernation, reproductive season, which you see in many birds, migration and spawning seasons, which you see in fish. The stimulus for this is typically physical in nature, so the temperature, how long the day is, and it usually coincides with food or resource availability, which makes sense. They're going to like wake from hibernation when they can eat. Right, bears only come out of hibernation when there's going to be enough food to survive until the next hibernation. They don't wake up in the dead of winter and they're like, oh my gosh, there's no food around, what do I do? Like, no, that doesn't make sense. And they've evolved to perfect this behavior. Climate change, though, is having a negative effect on these cycles, right? Because it's stimulating earlier waking from hibernation, and food is not available. I sort of mentioned that the change in like temperature and the change of like migration patterns is having an effect. Some are adapting to it, but there's not everything is changing in the same way. So there have been some like growing pains, I will say, and some concerning behaviors, because we are starting to lose some populations of animals because they cannot evolve fast enough to keep up with this. Circadian behavior, this is daily rhythmical behaviors. It's controlled by like an internal body clock. Genetic in nature, of course, typically optimized by the 24-hour light-dark cycle. So this is essential for healthy function of metabolism, hormone production, sleeping, feeding patterns. This is why you are typically tired at the same time, and no matter what time you go to bed, you'll probably wake up around the same time if you're consistent. Like even on, for me, I will I will use myself for example, because I feel like you guys go to bed a little bit later than I do. I typically go to bed around 10:30 every night, and I'm tired by then every day. So my body knows, whoa, it's it's getting late, like time to start like getting ready for bed. And even on the weekends, I will wake up by 6:37, 6:30/7, not like that exact minute. My body is used to this. I've been waking up with this sort of pattern for years now. It has just become my circadian rhythm. And so that is how my body works. That is my body clock. And then lunar, we talked about this, but we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth here. So turtles have synchronized nesting. It leads to an increased chance of survival of the hatchlings, right? You have too many little baby turtles for predators to eat all of them. They will probably lose, and by probably I mean they will definitely lose some of the turtle babies, but enough will survive that the species will live on. So lunar cycles control this migration because it deals with the tide and it deals with illuminating the beach. So one population goes from the Pacific US to Indonesia, and a mass egg-laying event takes place at high tide when the moon is specifically between its last and first quarters. That is such a specific time, and it happens every single time. That is incredibly specific, and that is something that has been studied. So that's just an interesting dependence on the moon. So at this point in the cycle, the tide is the weakest, so eggs are not as exposed to predators on the beach when the tide moves out. It's for protection when the turtles are ready to be hatched and actually move out into the ocean. It ends up perfectly aligning with time so that they have, they're not like immediately underwater. They will walk on the beach and get to the water, but it's not, it's just like a perfectly evolved situation. It's frankly impressive that they have figured this out. All right, and the last thing we're going to talk about is animals' ability to learn. Specifically, we're going to use the example of blue tits. Blue tits are a bird. They sort of look like blue jays, but they have a yellow belly. And they are such a funny little animal. They're just interesting to me. Of course, all of this is interesting to me. But they're an excellent example of an animal actually developing a learned behavior, and then when that behavior was no longer helpful, they lost the ability to do the behavior. So I want you to picture, long ago, probably way before you guys were born, actually before I was born too, but bottles of milk were delivered to your door, right? You had a milkman. On the bottles of milk, you had cream that would settle on the top of the bottle. And so these blue tits realized that there was cream on the top of the bottle, and they would just drink out of the bottle and drink all of the cream. And so they just took advantage of that, and they were like, sweet, free food, like, you snooze, you lose, buddy. And so then the dairy company was like, okay, these birds are drinking the milk, like, that's kind of gross, we don't really want that, our customers don't want that, and so they changed the tops of the bottle. And so they changed it by putting a seal on the top of the bottle. Well, the blue tits already knew, like, they had an innate behavior to peel bark on trees off. That's how they found, like, bugs and stuff. So they had this ability already to, like, grab a piece of bark and peel it back off of a tree. And so they just took that behavior that they already knew and they applied it to this new situation, and they just peeled the aluminum seals off of the milk bottles, and they were like, okay, like, I already know how to do this. So it was like one extra step, but they were still drinking the cream out of the milk because they had a learned behavior that they could alter to continue to benefit. So there was not enough energy expenditure versus the energy that they gained by drinking this cream. And because they're such social birds, once one realized that they could do it, it spread like wildfire through the blue tit population. And basically, it was like just open feeding season. They just opened up all the milk and just drank all the cream from the milk, regardless of if it was sealed or not. And I just think that is so clever of them. Eventually, obviously, men stopped bringing milk to your door, and so I think at this point that behavior is probably lost. If you put a sealed milk in front of a blue tit, I'm not sure that they would be able to do that anymore, just because it's like it's been sort of like through reproduction it's been lost. But I'm not sure about that. But it is this this whole idea of blue tits stealing your milk is like hilarious to me. Anyways, okay, so that is the end of this. That is the end of ethology. That is the end of option A. That is the end of your notes. You did it. I'm proud of you. I will see you in class.